Probably 95% of all React apps out there fetch some kind of data from some API, making data fetching an essential skill when building web applications. Now, one way of fetching data in a React app is inside an effect. And so that's what this section is all about. So in this section, we'll continue working on the Use Popcorn project as we learn all about side effects. So we're going to focus on the use effect hook, how and when effects are executed, and how we can clean effects up. And loading external data into our applications finally makes them feel a lot more real world and alive. And so let's quickly get started. So in this section, we're finally gonna come back to our Use Popcorn project. However, before we go any further, we just need to look at one more slide here, where we will quickly learn about the life cycle of components, because this is gonna be highly relevant for the rest of the section. And actually, I should say that we're gonna learn about the life cycle of a component instance, because it's only an actual physical instance of a component that can go through a life cycle. But as I mentioned earlier, it's just a bit too much work to always say component instance. And so for the rest of this lecture, I will just say component most of the time, which is what everybody else also does. So no one can always say component instance. That's just too much work. But anyway, what does component lifecycle actually mean? Well, the lifecycle of a component basically encompasses the different phases that a specific component instance can go through over time. And the first phase in any component's lifecycle is that the component instance is mounted, which is also called the initial render. So this is when the component is rendered for the very first time based on everything that we have learned in the previous section. This is also when fresh state and props are created for the component instance. And therefore, I like to use the analogy that the component is born in this phase. Now, once the component has been rendered and is on the screen, it can be re-rendered an unlimited number of times. Now, as we learned in the previous section, a React application is re-rendered whenever there is a state update, right? However, back then, we were only talking about the entire application, not about one specific component instance. So, in practical terms, a component will also be re-rendered when the props that it receives change, when its parent component re-renders, or when something called context changes. And more about context later. Now, the re-render phase is actually optional, so it doesn't always happen in all components. So some components are only mounted and then unmounted right away, which actually brings us to the next phase. So finally, there comes a point in time where a component instance is no longer needed. And so that's when the component is unmounted. And as you can see from that not so subtle emoji, this is when the component basically dies. So in this step, the component instance is completely destroyed and removed from the screen, along with its state and props. And of course, we have already seen this happening many times in the applications that we have been building. So this can happen when users navigate to a new section or a new page of the app, or when they close the app altogether. Now, of course, a new instance of the same component can be mounted later, but this specific instance is now gone. So it has been unmounted. And that's actually it. So pretty straightforward, right? Especially after that deep dive last section. So why was it even worth learning about this now? Well, it's important to know about the component lifecycle because we can hook into different phases of this lifecycle. So we can basically define code to be executed at these specific points in time, which can be extremely useful. And we do so by using the useEffect hook, which is the big topic of this section. Let's now load some data into a React application for the very first time. However, in this lecture, let's start by doing it the wrong way, basically, which is going to be a great learning experience. So in this section, we are going to go back to our Use Popcorn application that we have been working on before. And so let's now grab the project folder and open it back up in VS Code. All right. Now here, let's start by actually duplicating this file. And then I'm going to rename one of them to app version 1. And so by doing this, we are not going to overwrite the code that we have written before. And so you can keep it as a reference. Now, as we have learned before in the previous section, we should never update state in render logic, right? But now in this lecture, let's actually break that rule so that we can see why it actually exists in the first place. And breaking rules like this is actually a pretty great way of learning React and also its rules even better. Now the idea here is to fetch some movie data as soon as the app component here mounts for the very first time. So as soon as it has its initial render. So to fetch that data, we use the OMDB API, which is basically like an open version of IMDb. Now to get started, you need to get your own API key, which you can get for free just by clicking here and then filling out this form. And so immediately you will then get your free API key. And then once you have that, you can just come back here to the main page so we can see how we can use this API. So our data requests should simply be sent to this URL. So just copy that. And then here, let's fetch the data using the fetch API. So using the fetch function like this. All right. Now, in case you're not familiar with the fetch function and on how to work with asynchronous JavaScript, then please go back to the beginning of the course and take a look at the JavaScript review section, where I talk about all that in great length. But anyway, here now, of course, you need to place your own key. And actually, I want to do this. So I want to place this key in a separate variable. So let's define that out here. So key. And by now, after that long previous section, you know why we should actually define a variable like this outside the component function. And the reason for that is that each time the component gets re-rendered, this entire function here will be executed again. So basically all the render logic. And so if this variable definition here is part of that render logic, it will also be recreated each time that the component renders, which is in this case, of course, not a big deal, but it's good to already get into the habit of not doing that. So when you're just defining a variable like this, that doesn't depend on anything that's inside the component, then just declare it outside. Now I'm just getting my own API key, but of course you should use your own one here. And now let's go back to the documentation page where we can see that we can query the API in two ways. So we can search for an ID or a title, or we can actually search by some query string. And so that's actually what we will do here. So here, let's use s and then equal, and then here you can type your favorite movie, which for me probably is Interstellar. Not 100% sure of that, but it's definitely a great one. Okay, but anyway, now we need to handle the promise that the fetch function here returns inside, and of course here it's then, so inside a then method, which gets access to the response And then here we can convert that response to JSON immediately, which will return another promise. And so we chain on another then, and then here we get access to the data, which we can then, for now, log to the console. And for now, that's actually it. So let's see what we get here. Or of course, we first need to actually start our application. So make sure you are in the right project folder here, and then type npm start. So that should then open up the new tab here. And indeed, there it is. So let's check out our console. And let's just reload quickly. And indeed, you see that React was able to fetch the data from the API. So we are just interested in the search here. And so all the movies here are in fact about Interstellar, which means that our query here is already working. Now, as we learned in the previous section, this data fetching that we're doing right here is actually introducing a side effect into the component's render logic. So it is clearly an interaction with the outside world, which should never be allowed in render logic. So again, all this code that is here at the top level of the function is of course code that will run as the component first mounts, and therefore it is called render logic. And so again, here we should have no side effects. I mean, in this example where we only log something to the console, it actually appears to work just fine. But watch what happens if we set some state here. And to do that, let's actually first get rid of our temporary data here. So this movie data and watched data, we only used like as a template for the previous section, but now let's get rid of that. And so as I was just saying, let's now here actually set state. So that list of movies that we get from the API, we now want to get it into our movie state. And so that's at data.search. Give it a save, and beautiful. So we got some data from the API now showing up in our UI. But watch what happens when we check out the network tab. So you see that it's basically running an infinite number of requests here. So it keeps going and it never really stops. So every second our app is firing off multiple fetch requests to this API, which of course is a really, really bad idea. So why do you think that is? Why do you think all these fetch requests are being fired off? Well, the reason is that setting the state here in the render logic will then immediately cause the component to re-render itself again. So that's just how state works, right? However, as the component is re-rendered, the function here, of course, is executed again, which then will fetch again, which in turn will set the movies again as well. And then this whole thing starts over and over again. So as the state is dead, the component is re-rendered again, which then will fetch again, which will set the movies again. And so this really is an infinite loop of state setting and then the component re-rendering. And so this is the reason why it is really not allowed to set state in render logic. So let's quickly set this back here so that we don't have like a million requests here. And so as we reload, then it stops. And let's just see another example here quickly. So let's say we did set watched immediately here in the top level code to some empty array. And then actually we do get a real error. I mean, let's reload that. And yeah, here we are now reloading all the time again the data from the API. But what matters here is that we get the error of too many re-renders. And so that's now because of this state setting right here. So if we're really setting the state here in the top level, even without being inside a then handler, then immediately React will complain that there are too many renders, which means that we again entered that infinite loop where updating state will cause the component to re-render, which will cause the state to be set, and so on into infinity. So let's of course get rid of that. Let's reload here. And so now we are again good. However, we do actually want to set the state here. So we do want set movies here, but without all the problems that we just saw. And so how can we do that? Well, that's where we need the useEffect hook, which we will learn about in the next lecture. So let's now learn about the next important tool in our React toolbox, which is the useEffect hook. So we already know about the useState hook, and so now it's time for our second hook, which is, again, the useEffect hook. Now, the idea of the useEffect hook is to give us a place where we can safely write side effects like this one. Just, again, like our data fetching. But the side effects registered with the useEffect hook will only be executed after certain renders. For example, only right after the initial render, which is exactly what we are looking for in the situation. Now we will learn all about what this hook actually is, but for now, let's just use it in practice. So just like with useState, we just write useEffect, and then we also need to make sure that it has been imported automatically here from React. So just like useState, again, this is also a function that is part of React, and so therefore that we need to import. Now the useEffect doesn't return anything, so we don't store the result into any variable, but instead we pass in a function. And so this function is then called our effect, and it contains the code that we want to run as a side effect. So basically that we want to register as a side effect to be executed at a certain point in time. So let's paste that here, but we are actually not done yet, because now we need to pass in a second argument, which is the so-called dependency array. Now this dependency array is actually the most confusing part of this hook, and we will again learn all about this throughout this section. But for now, what you need to do here is to just pass in this empty array, which means that the effect that we just specified here will only run on mount. So it will only run when this app component here renders for the very first time. And so now here, let's change this back to set movies, give it a save, and yeah, our movies here are now in the user interface. But even more importantly, let's check if the problem from before has been solved. And indeed, now we have no more infinite loops here and no more infinite requests to our API. So the problem that we created in the previous lecture has indeed been fixed. And so now our effect is only running as the component mounts. Great. And so this is basically the very bare bones way in which we do data fetching in simple React applications like this one. At least if we want to fetch our data as soon as the application loads. Now, in a larger, more real-world application, we may use some external library for data fetching. But again, in a small application like this one, this is now a great way to fetch some data on mount. So when our application first loads. So let's just quickly recap here. So we used the useEffect hook to register an effect. And so that effect is this function right here, which contains the side effect that we want to register. And basically register means that we want this code here not to run as the component renders, but actually after it has been painted onto the screen. And so that's exactly what useEffect does. So while before the code was executed while the component was rendering, so while the function was being executed, now this effect will actually be executed after render. And so that's a lot better. Then, as a second argument, we passed this empty array here into useEffect. And so this means that this effect will only be executed as the component first mounts. Okay, and that's actually it. So this is how we use the useEffect hook in practice in a simple situation like this. And so next up, let's now take a bit of a closer look at this new hook. So we just used the useEffect hook for the very first time in order to fetch movie data as the component mounts. But what actually is an effect, and how is it different from an event handler function? Well, let's find out in this video. And just so we're all on the same page, let's start by reviewing what a side effect is. So basically, in React, a side effect is any interaction between a React component and the world outside that component. And we can think of a side effect as some code that actually makes something useful happen. For example, fetching data from some API. So what this means is that we actually need side effects all the time when we build React apps. Now, we already know that side effects should not happen during the component render. Or in other words, side effects should not be in render logic. Instead, we can create side effects in two different places in React. And the first one is inside event handlers. And remember that event handlers are simply functions that are triggered whenever the event that they are listening to happens. However, simply reacting to events is sometimes not enough for what an application needs. Instead, in some situations, we need to write some code that will be executed automatically as the component renders. And so this is when we can create a so-called effect by using the useEffect hook. So by creating an effect, we can basically write code that will run at different moments of a component instance lifecycle. So when the component mounts, when it re-renders, or even when it unmounts. And this is really great because it opens up a whole new door of possibilities. Okay, but let's now get just a bit deeper into how effects work by comparing event handlers to effects created with the useEffect hook. And let's go back to the example of fetching movie data that we have been using. So fetching movie data is very clearly a side effect because it's clearly an interaction with the world outside the component. Now, there are two different possibilities of when we might want to create this side effect. The first possibility is that we might want to fetch movie data only when a certain event happens. So in that case, we would of course just use an event handler function. So just like we have been doing up until this point. I mean, we haven't been using event handlers to fetch data, but we have used them for other stuff. Now, the other possibility of when to fetch the data would be to do so immediately after the component mounts, so after it is first rendered. And so this is exactly what we did in the previous lecture, when we first used the useEvent hook to specify an effect that was executed right after the component was painted to the screen. So we can say that these two pieces of code produce the exact same result. So they both fetch data about a movie, but they do so at different moments in time. So the event handler executes when an event happens, and the effect executes whenever the component first renders, at least in this situation, because the exact moment at which the effect is executed actually depends on its dependency array, which I shortly mentioned in the last video. So we can basically use this dependency array to tell the effect to also run after a component re-renders. But I won't go deep into this right now because that's easier to explain with code. But speaking of the dependency array, this array is just one of three parts that any effect can have. So besides the dependency array, we have of course the effect code itself, and also each effect can return a so-called cleanup function, which is a function that will be called before the component re-renders or unmounts. Now, thinking about different moments of the component lifecycle, so mounting, re-rendering, and unmounting, can be very helpful to understand how effects work. However, we should actually not think about life cycles, but about synchronization. So the real reason why effects exist is not to run code at different points of the life cycle, but to keep a component synchronized with some external system. So in this example, that would be to keep the component in sync with the movie data that comes from some external API. And if that sounds super confusing, keep in mind that this is just a first introduction to effects. We will come back to all this after having used the useEffect hook a bit more in practice. But anyway, to finish our comparison here, as we just learned, we use effects to keep a component in sync with the external world, while on the other hand, we use event handlers to react to a certain event that happened in the user interface. Now, what's very important to note here is that event handlers are always the preferred way of creating side effects. So whenever possible, we should not overuse the useEffect hook. So basically, everything that can be handled inside event handlers should be handled there. Let's now convert our effect to an async function instead of the basic promise handling that we're doing right now. So many times when we need a lot of code to handle a promise, it's a lot easier and nicer to just have an async function. And here I will just assume that you already know what async await is. So we might think that all we need to do in order to use an async function is to place the async keyword here and then use await inside of it. However, we immediately get this warning from ESLint, which tells us that effect callbacks are synchronous to prevent race conditions. So basically, the effect function that we place into useEffect cannot return a promise, which is what an async function does. So instead of doing it directly like this, we just create a new function. And then we place the async function in there. So let's call this one fetch movies. Okay. And then let's, of course, adapt this function here to using the await keyword. So const res equals await. And again, I'm assuming that you already know how all of this works. So that converting to promises to an async function is nothing new for you at this point. So data will be the result of converting the response to JSON, which is again an asynchronous operation. And then finally, we can set the movies to data.search. So just what we had here. All right, but now of course nothing is happening because nowhere we are calling this function. So that's also why this gets this yellow underline here. So our effect is now this function right here, right? But this function, all it's doing right now is to define yet another function. So this async fetch movies. And so then at the end, we just call it, and then it is back to working. Now here I just want to extract this here for now into another variable, which I'm going to call query. And this is just temporary here. Okay. And now what I also want to do is to log our movies here. So the movies that we received from the API to the console, just so I can show you something. So let's first reload to get rid of the errors there. And now what I want to do here again is to log our movies to the console. So do you think that I can just do this? So you think that this is going to work? Well, let's see. And let's reload to actually see the true result, which is an empty array. So why is this happening? Well, hopefully you learned in the previous section that setting state is asynchronous. So in other words, after the state has been set here in this line of code, or actually after we instructed React to set the state, that doesn't mean that this happens immediately. So instead, it will happen after this function here has been called. And so right here in this line of code, we have stale state, which basically means that we still have the old value as the state was before. And in this case, before, it was just the empty array. So our initial state. So here we can basically then use data.search again. And so as we reload now, then we get here the output. Now, what I wanted to talk about is why we always have these two outputs. So basically why we have these two requests here happening. Well, the reason for that is React's strict mode. So when strict mode is activated in React 18, our effects will not run only once, but actually twice. So React will call our effects twice, but only in development. So when our application is in production, this will no longer be happening. And so this is just so that React can identify if there are any problems with our effects. So if we come here quickly just to index.js, and if we remove the strict mode from here, well, then we have this problem. Let's actually remove the code. Let's save and let's reload. And then you see that we only get one output here, which means that there was only one HTTP request. So the effect was only called once, indeed. But let's put it back because this is somehow a bit safer. Okay, and that's it for this video. Next up, let's make this data fetching here a bit more complete with a loading state. Let's now add a very simple loading indicator to our application. So basically, whenever the movie data here is still being loaded in the background, we want to instead display some kind of loading indicator right here. And to show you what I mean, let's come here to the network tab, which is always a good friend when we're dealing with HTTP requests. And then let's throttle our network here to a slow 3G. And so then I can easier show you what I mean. So all of this will now take a lot of time to load, but here you now see this flash where there is no content, basically. So the movie data was loading, but hadn't arrived yet. And so now, again, in the meantime, we want to display some loading indicator. So in order to do that, we need some more state. So a state variable, which basically tells our UI that the data is still being loaded. And then as soon as the data has been loaded, we want to display then the data and not that loading indicator anymore. But anyway, let's simply create that state variable. And usually it is called isLoading. And so then set isLoading. And let's start with false. Now then let's come here to our effect, into our async function. And so then right before the fetching actually starts, let's set isLoading to true. And so this then will indicate our UI that loading is being happened and that we can then render that indicator over there. And then when all of this is done, so let's do it right at the very end. So this one we don't need anymore. So here, after everything is finished, we can then set the isLoading state back to false. And now it's very easy. So here inside this box, we basically want to say that if isLoading, then we want to display that indicator, and I will actually create a new component for that. Let's call it loader, or else display that movie list. Okay. So creating that loader, that's just very simple. We just return a paragraph with the class of loader. And then here we can say just loading. So many times in web applications, you will get like a rotating spinner or something like that. But you immediately saw that it was already working. So as I save now the code, it will always refetch the data. But let's try it again here manually. Let's wait for it. So now it's still the application that's being loaded. So we get this white screen in the meantime. But now it has started fetching the data. Then it displayed that loader, so that new component here. But then as soon as isLoading was set to false, it was time to actually display our movie list. And so with this, this whole behavior is a bit more natural and also a bit more real world, because in all real applications, you always have some indication to the user that some data is being fetched. So whenever we are doing any data fetching in any web application and dealing with asynchronous data, we always need to assume that something can go wrong. And so therefore, let's now account for that situation by handling those errors. So one of the things that can go wrong is your users suddenly losing their internet connection. So let's simulate that here again in our network tab. And let's make sure that we are first on slow 3G. Then let's reload here. And then while the movies are loaded, we will click on offline. So right now. So you see that now the application basically never leaves this state. And also when we come to our console, here we see that we failed to fetch, which again is because our user basically now lost their internet connection. So when that happens, we want to display some kind of error message here on the screen and not keep the application in this loading state here forever. Because like this, the user will think that the data might eventually arrive. But of course, it will not. Now, reacting to errors like this is actually not built into the fetch function itself. And so we have to kind of do that manually. And so let's try that here in our fetch movies function. So here on the response object that we receive from fetch exists one OK property. And so here we can check for that. So basically, if the response is not OK, then we want to throw a new error. And again, this is pretty standard JavaScript code. So then let's just say something went wrong with fetching movies. Okay, and so now if we throw an error here, we need to wrap all of our code into a try catch block. So try and catch, which again is just a normal JavaScript feature. This one has nothing to do with React. Okay, then here let's console.error that error. Okay, and then let's come back here. Well, if we load now, then of course nothing will work. So let's do that trick again, where first we set it to slow 3G. Then let's reload. And then let's wait for it. We set our users back to offline right now. And so, where is it? Well, it's not actually anywhere here, but well, that's not really important anyway. So let's actually just log error.message. So this is the property of the error where this string here will get saved into. But then what we're actually interested in is to get this message here onto the screen. So basically displaying it right here instead of loading. So that means that we need another piece of state. So basically a piece of state indicating whether we currently have an error or not. So const error and set error. And so here this one is actually not a Boolean, but it's truly the error message. Okay, so here let's then set the error to actually that message. And again, error.message is basically this string that we passed into the error. And error is the error itself as it was passed into this catch block. And again, that is just basic JavaScript. All right. And then let's do some conditional rendering here to basically get the error here onto the screen whenever there exists one. Okay, and let's start by creating a new error component here, or maybe let's call it error message, and it will receive a prop with some message that it will then display on the screen. So let's return again a paragraph, this time with the class name of error, which as always I already included into my CSS file. Then here let's maybe add some small emoji here, like this one. So showing there was some kind of problem. And then here we simply display that message. So this is a very simple presentational component. Remember that? Okay, now here in our conditional rendering, basically what we want to do is that when it's no longer loading, then we want to display this movie list, but only if there was no error. So basically here we now would have to nest another ternary inside this ternary, but that makes for really ugly code. And so let's do something else instead. So let's comment out this entire part, or well, only this one. So the box, of course, we still need. But then let's do is loading, and if there's no error, then display this movies list right here. Now, if there is an error, then display the error message component with the error, or I think it's called message. So with the message prop set to error. And here, of course, it needs to be that the data is not loading and there is no error. And finally, we also need to account, of course, for the is loading state. So if it is loading, then just display our loader. So here the situation is indeed a little bit tricky with all these different states that we have and with all the conditional rendering, but well, these are now three mutually exclusive conditions. So it is either loading, or it is not loading and there is no error, or there is an error. So only one of these three here can be true at the same time. And so that's very important so that we don't display multiple of these components at the same time by mistake. So let's give it a save and let's try again. So back to our 3G. And then I will set it to offline very soon. Let's wait for it. And there it is. So we get our error message correctly displayed here. However, there's still some problem because the loading state is still set to true. And in fact, that's actually correct. So as soon as the error here is thrown, this rest of the code is no longer evaluated. And so therefore, is loading is never set to false. So our application will keep thinking that the data is still being loaded. So again, the problem is that after this error is being thrown, then React will basically never see this piece of code here where the loading state is reset. So instead of doing that here, let's attach a finally block here. So this block of code here will basically always be executed at the very end. Okay, and as an alternative, we could have kept the code here and also pasted it here, but that would have created a duplication of code. So with this, it's going to be a lot better. Now, I will not try this yet here, because actually I want to handle another kind of error, which is not really an error, but also a situation where we want to display a message, which is the situation in which we cannot find any movie for the search query. So let's say the query is like this one here. And of course, the API will not find anything. So let's remove all throttling. And well, what happens here? Well, basically the length cannot be read of undefined. And so the problem here is that the data that comes back from the API now is apparently undefined. So let's take a look at that. So just add data here, and let's try that again. And so indeed, we no longer have the search property here. So we no longer have data.search. And so what's happening then is that data.search is being set to undefined. And therefore we get this other error here. So as I was saying in the very beginning, we always need to handle all these different situations that can go wrong. And when we are working with data fetching, there's always a lot of things that can go wrong. So working with data is a lot of work, but it's also essential in most, if not all, web applications. But anyway, here we can now use this response to our advantage in order to throw another error in this situation. So we can say that data.response, and actually this now needs to be here after we already have the data. So in this case, if data.response is equal false, and so for some reason the API here responds with a string of false and not a Boolean, but well, this still works. So in this case, let's also throw a new error, and let's simply say movie not found. All right, and beautiful. Let's just reload, and then here we get this log. So that's this console.error coming from here, and then indeed we get our error message also displayed on the UI. So this one was maybe a little bit trickier. So let's just quickly recap. So what we did was to implement another state variable, this time specific for the error, so that whenever some error occurred, we could store the error message in there and then display it in the UI as soon as an error occurred. Now, as soon as an error did occur, which is in this situation and in this one, we threw a new error and then we caught that error inside the catch block of this try catch. And so this is a standard way of catching errors in JavaScript. And so in this situation, we then set the error state to the message of the error that we specified here. Then finally, we used, of course, that state variable in order to render something on the screen conditionally. And so that was right here. So this part here is maybe a bit confusing, and so make sure that after this video you just analyze exactly what's happening here, and that in fact these three conditions here are mutually exclusive. So only one of them will ever be true. Okay, and I think that for now this is enough for error handling in this application. So that's always a very, very important part that many people overlook, but it is of course essential to deal with this kind of situations. So I have mentioned the useEffect dependency array a few times already, but we don't know yet what it actually does and how it works. So let's change that in this lecture. So as we saw at the beginning of this section, by default, an effect will run after each and every render. However, that's almost never what we want. But the good news is that we can change this default behavior by passing a dependency array into the useEffect hook as a second argument. But why does useEffect actually need an array of dependencies, you might ask? Well, the reason is that without this array, React doesn't know when to actually run the effect. But if we do specify the effect dependencies by passing in the dependency array, the effect will be executed each time that one of the dependencies changes. And we will come back to why this is so amazing in the next slide. But for now, this is all you need to know. Now, what exactly are those dependencies? Well, effect dependencies are state variables and props that are used inside the effect. And the rule is that each and every one of those state variables and props must be included in the dependency array. But let's take a look at an example to understand what I'm talking about. And the code here is really not important. What matters is that the effect uses the title prop and the user rating state. We can clearly see at the top of the code that title is indeed a prop and that user rating is indeed a piece of state. Therefore, both of them must be included in the dependency array. So the effect function depends on these variables to do its work, and therefore we need to tell React about them. Otherwise, if the title or the user rating changes, React will not know about this change, and therefore it won't be able to re-execute the effect code. And this will then lead to a bug called stale closure. And we will talk about what a stale closure is, and also about some more rules for the dependency array in a later, more advanced section. But for now, let's actually understand why the dependency array is so important for the useEffect hook. So I like to think of the useEffect hook as an event listener that is listening for one or more dependencies to change. And when one of the dependencies does change, useEffect will simply execute the effect again. So a bit like a regular event listener, but for effects. But let's go back to our previous example where we had the title and user rating dependencies in the array. So whenever the title or the user rating changes, React will execute the effect again. So it will run the code one more time, which will in turn update the document title. So the website title that we see in a browser tab. So essentially, effects react to updates to state and props that are used inside the effect, because again, those are the effect's dependencies. So in a way, effects are reactive, just like React reacts to state updates by re-rendering the UI. And this is extremely useful and powerful, as we will see throughout the rest of the course. But all this only works if we correctly specify the dependency array. Okay, but now let's remember how I said in the very first lecture about effects that effects are used to keep a component synchronized with some external system. So some system that lives outside of our React-based code. And if we think about it, that's exactly what is happening here. So the state and props of our component are now in fact synchronized with an external system, which is, in this case, the title of the document. Now, updating the title in some other way will of course not magically update the title or user rating. So the synchronization only works in one way. But that's not really the point. The same actually happens with state updates, and we still say that the UI is in sync with state. So the point is that useEffect truly is a synchronization mechanism. So a mechanism to synchronize effects with the state of the application. And you will discover this each time that you're going to use an effect. And so let's go explore this a little bit further. So as we just learned, whenever a dependency changes, the effect is executed again. But now let's remember that dependencies are always state or props. And what happens to a component each time that its state or props are updated? Well, that's right, the component will re-render. This means that effects and the lifecycle of a component instance are deeply interconnected. That's why, when the useEffect hook was first introduced, many people thought that it was a lifecycle hook, rather than a hook for synchronizing the component with a side effect. Now, the conclusion and the big takeaway from this is that we can use the dependency array in order to run effects whenever the component renders or re-renders. So, in a way, the useEffect hook is actually about synchronization and about the component lifecycle. Okay, and so with this knowledge, let's look at the 3 different types of dependency arrays that we can specify, and also how they affect both synchronization and lifecycle. So when we have multiple dependencies, like in this first example, variables x, y, and z, it means that the effect synchronizes with x, y, and z. Now, in terms of the lifecycle, it means that the effect will run on the initial render and also on each re-render triggered by updating one of the dependencies x, y, or z. So, again, just to make this crystal clear, the effect will be executed each time the component instance is being re-rendered by an update to x, y, or z. But if some other piece of state or prop is updated, then this particular effect will not be executed. Now, if we have an empty dependency array, that means that the effect synchronizes with no state or props, and therefore it will only run on mount. In other words, if an effect has no dependencies, it doesn't use any values that are relevant for rendering the component, and so therefore it's safe to be executed only once. Finally, if we have no array at all, we already know that the effect will run on every render, which is usually a really bad idea and not what we want. Now, if the effect runs on every render, that basically means that the effect synchronizes with everything. So essentially, every state and every prop in the component will be dependencies in this case. And now to finish, let's look at when exactly effects are executed during the render and commit process. Now, I mentioned in the first lecture on effects that effects are executed after render. And while that's not wrong, it's also not the full story. So let's look at a timeline of events that happen as components render and re-render. And I found this extremely useful when I first learned about the useEffect hook myself. And so I think that you will benefit from this as well. So, as we already know, the whole process starts with mounting the component instance. In this case, an instance of movie details. After that, the result of rendering is committed to the DOM, and finally, the DOM changes are painted onto the screen by the browser. So this is just what we learned in the previous section. But where do effects come into play here? Well, effects are actually only executed after the browser has painted the component instance on the screen. So not immediately after render, as you might have thought initially. That's why we say that effects run asynchronously after the render has already been painted to the screen. And the reasons why effects work this way is that effects may contain long-running processes, such as fetching data. So in a situation like that, if React would execute the effect before the browser paints a new screen, it would block this entire process and users would see an old version of the component for way too long. And of course, that would be very undesirable. Now, one important consequence of the fact that effects do not run during render is that if an effect sets state, then a second additional render will be required to display the UI correctly. And so this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't overuse effects. Okay, but moving on now, let's say that the title was initially set to Interstellar, but then it changes to Interstellar Wars. And since this title is a prop, it means that the component will re-render and the DOM changes will be committed and painted to the screen again. Now, since title is part of the dependency array of this effect, the effect will be executed again at this point. So just as we learned in the last slide. And this whole process can of course be repeated over and over again until this movie details instance finally unmounts and disappears from the screen. Now, you might notice that there is actually a hole between the commit and browser paint, right? And the reason is that in React, there's actually another type of effect called a layout effect. So the only difference between a regular effect and a layout effect is that the layout effect runs before the browser actually paints the new screen. But we almost never need this. And so the React team actually discourages the use of this use layout effect hook. I simply mentioned this here so that you know that this also exists. And actually there are even 2 more holes in this timeline, but we will talk about these mystery steps by the end of the section. So stay tuned for that. Let's now put some of the things that we just learned in the previous lecture into practice, and also magically synchronize our search query with the movie search results. And I actually want to start this lecture with a couple of experiments. And to do that, let's first do a couple of changes here. First, let's set this back to Interstellar. And I also want to rename this variable here to temp query. And that's because now we actually want to get the query state that right now lives here inside search into the app, so into its parent component. So let's cut this from here, and we will then later pass in both of these back in. So query and set query. Okay, so we're basically lifting this state up because we will need it here inside the app component. So now let's pass those props in. So that's query equals query, and set query is of course set, well, not error, set query. Apparently I wrote the name of the movie wrong here, Interstellar. And then also let's get rid of this console.log here. Okay, let's reload just to clean this up. And now let's do those experiments that I was talking about. So basically I want to write a couple of effects here, and then I want you to guess in which order they will be executed. At least that's going to be our first experiment. So let's write one effect. And then as always, we need to specify a function. And this one will log to the console the string A. All right, then let's get another one. And notice how this one doesn't have a dependency array. Well, let's actually add it to this one. But the second one here won't have any. So this one will just log the string B. And then finally, I will simply do a console.log right here in the top level. Okay, and now without running this code, let's try to guess in which order these 3 strings here will appear in the console. So, have you thought about it? Well, I will now save, and then we will discuss the results. Okay, and actually we have a lot of renders here, a lot of results, but that's because the application has rendered and re-rendered a couple of times. And so then we got all these logs. And also keep in mind that these effects actually run twice. But what matters here is that first we got C, then A, and then B. So why did we get C first, even though it appears later here in the code? Well, the reason is that, as we just discussed before, effects actually only run after the browser paint, while the render logic itself runs, well, as the name says, during render. And so then it makes sense that, of course, this console.log here is executed first, so during the render of this component. And then we have A and B, which comes from these two effects, and so A is rendered first simply because it appears first in the code. Okay, now let's actually clear the console, and now what I'm going to do is to type something here. And so let's see what happens then. And we get some more outputs. So we get C and B. So is this what you were expecting? Well, let's again analyze what just happened here. So we updated the state here, which is the query state. And as a result, the component was re-rendered. And then, just like before, this code here was executed, and so therefore we see the letter C first. And then after that, we also have a B log. And so that is this effect here, which has no dependency array, which, remember, basically means that this effect is synchronized with everything. And so therefore it needs to run on every render, while this other effect here, this first effect, is synchronized with no variables at all, which is the meaning of this empty array. And therefore this effect was not executed as the component was re-rendered with the query state. Okay, so now we can change here the strings, and we can actually say that this here is during render, this here is after every render, and this is after the initial render. Okay, and of course this is only for you to keep as a reference here, just so we're understanding what's actually happening. So now let's do another one. So one final experiment here, which will be yet another effect. Let's call this one D now. And here in the dependency array, we will have the query state. So give it a save. And now watch what happens when I type here. So you see that this one here during render, of course, always gets executed. Then this one here after every render as well. And still not this one, but we now have this other effect which is synchronized with the query state variable. And so this query just changed, and therefore this effect was executed and logged D. And if we keep doing this, then D keeps getting logged to the console. While if we changed some of these other states here, then we would not get D logged here. So we cannot really simulate that here now, but you can still trust me on that one. But anyway, let's now use what we just did here to our actual advantage in the application. So I will now just comment these out and reload here. And so now the time has come where we actually want to use the query from here right inside this URL where we fetch the movies. So basically we want to fetch movies based on the search query right here. So instead of the temporary query, let's now use query here. Give it a save, but of course, like this, it is not going to work. So as we change this here to something, nothing is going to happen. And why is that? Well, it's because this effect is not yet synchronized with the query state. So we are using this state variable inside the effect, but the effect doesn't know yet that it will have to rerun each time that the query state changes. And so, to fix that, we need to include that query here in the dependency array. And actually you see already that React is complaining. So here, as we hover, we see that this hook has a missing dependency. So this error or this warning actually is really, really helpful so that we never forget to correctly declare the dependencies of this effect. And so as we give it a save now, let's again reload And here now we get this error that the movie is not found, which is because our query by default is just this empty string. But if we try now, let's say test, then, well, it still doesn't work. So let's come again to our network tab. So let's just check out if actually the HTTP request has been correctly made. And so by doing this, you're also learning about these very important developer tools here. Okay, so here we see some new HTTP requests. And as we click here, we actually do see a response. So there is something there, but somehow our movies are still not being shown here. And I think I know the reason for that, which is that we are never resetting the error state. So at some point we had some error here, but now we no longer have an error. But at no point in the application we are actually resetting it. So we need to also do that here in the finally. Or actually, better yet, we should do it right here at the very beginning. So basically, always before we start fetching for data, we reset the error. So set error, and then back to the empty string. Give it a save, and now we get some results for test. Okay, and then as we delete this, then we are back to movie not found. The same for inter for some reason, and then stellar, and now we get some movie here. It's not the same as before, and the reason for that is something called a race condition, but at least something is working here. So if I write this a bit slower, then it works just fine. And of course, this works with any other movie, as long as for now you type slow enough. Now I want to fix this problem that when we have no search query here, then it tells us movie not found, which is not really true. I mean, it is true because the API actually searched for a movie with an empty string, but in the situation where we have no query, we actually don't even want to search, right? And so let's do that here in our effect. And actually, let's do it before we even call this function here. So we can say if there is no query dot length, so it's going to be 0 in this situation, then simply set the movies back to an empty array. So basically then removing all the movies from the user interface. And let's also reset the error back to nothing and then return. And so in this situation, then the fetch movies function will not even be called. And here we can actually go even further. So we can say, like, if the query length is less than 3, then it's not even worth searching as well. So it doesn't even make sense to have a query just like this, right? So there's no movies really called like that. So going back again to our network tab, if we just type like this, you see then no new fetch requests were made. But now if I keep writing, so now we have more than 3 characters, then we had our first HTTP request to the API. Then we got these results, and if I type again, then you see we got another one. And now when I delete all this, then it simply goes back to empty. So we deleted all the movies from our state, basically. Okay, and so with this, we have the basic functionality already implemented. So let's recap what we just did here and what is going to happen whenever we type a new query here. So the query is, of course, a piece of state, right? So that is pretty obvious. And so we are referencing that query variable a couple of times inside our effect here, right? And so therefore, we then included this query variable also in the dependency array of this effect. And so now our useEffectHook is basically like an event handler that is listening for the query to change. And so then when it changes, the entire effect is executed again, which in our case means that a new request is going to be made to our movies API. So again, this effect that we just wrote here basically reacts to an update to this state variable, which makes the entire effect basically reactive. So reactive to that state. But at the same time, our effect will also be still executed during the initial render. Just right now, that is the empty string, which we just basically told our effect to ignore. So let's write another amazing movie here. And so as we save this now, and so as our application first loads, it will immediately fetch the data right here. And so indeed, as we just learned in the previous lecture, this effect basically now runs on the initial render and whenever this state variable here updates. So it is synchronized with this variable here. And as you see, this is really, really powerful and can be used in all kinds of situations. So make sure that you really understand everything that we just did here, as this was a really, really important lecture. And then let's move on to the next video where we will finally add the ability to select one of these movies so that we can then load some additional details here into the right side. So that's going to be really, really fun. And so I hope to see you there soon. Let's keep working on our application and allow users to select a movie so that they can see some details about it. So checking our demo app, what we want to do now, again, is to add the ability to select a movie like this, and so then our app will load some additional data about that movie and display it here. And then we can also go back by clicking on this button, which will then close that movie. All right. So basically that is adding some more dynamics to the application. And so what that means, once again, is that we need a new piece of state. And so that state will basically store which movie has been selected here. Now the selection itself, so updating the state, will happen here in this box on the left side, right? But the displaying of the movie happens here on the right side. So in this box. So this box will also need to know about the selected ID. And so this means that this new piece of state, so the selected ID state, will have to live here in the parent component. So right in app. So selected ID and set selected ID. Use state. And we are going to start with null. And here it's, of course, selected. Then here, let's get rid of this, which we don't need anymore. And now you might be wondering why here we are only going to store the ID and not the entire movie object itself. Well, the reason for that is that the movies that we get here from the search are very limited. So we only get the data really about the title, the year, and the poster here. While here on the right side, we will want all kinds of details that are not included in this first search. So there will have to be another API call. And we can see that here, when we click, it loads the movie again. And so only then all of these details here are fetched. And this fetch here, so this movie will be fetched based on the ID that we got here in this array. So let's take a look at that quickly. So it's very important that you understand how we actually built this application. So it's not just about the React concepts themselves, but also about the logic of how we build an application. So I think that's also pretty important. So let's see. So taking a closer look at our results, each of the objects has the poster, the title, the type, the year, and the ID. And again, it's based on this ID that we then will search for details. And actually, let's copy this ID here, and I will temporarily use that here. All right. So just so we can see what happens when we actually have a selected movie. Then we no longer need this. And now let's create a new component. And so that component will then be displayed if there is a selected ID. So basically that's like a selected movie. So movie list, movie, let's do it right here. Function selected movie. And this one will get as an input, as you can guess, the selected ID. So here let's for now just return a div with the class name of detail. And then for now, all we are going to do is to display that selected ID in there. All right. And now going back up here into our JSX, here on the right side, we now want to display not this, but instead that component that we just created in case that there is a selected ID. So let's wrap all of this into a JavaScript mode block, and then let's do a ternary operator. So all we have to do is to say if there is a selected ID, then display movie detail. So not sure why that's not appearing here. Maybe I gave it some other name. Selected movie. Well, actually I wanted to call it movie detail or movie details even. So that makes a bit more sense, I think. Yeah, so movie details. And then we pass in the selected ID. Okay. And if not, then that's where we want to display these two. However, this is not going to work. So let's see. And indeed, once again, it's because here we have a piece of JSX. So all this, which has basically two root elements. So it doesn't have just one single parent element, which remember is always necessary in a piece of JSX. And so this is yet another great use case of a fragment, because of course we don't want to create like a new div element or something like that around these two. So just like this. And again, the reason for that is here as the third part of the ternary operator, we needed a new piece of JSX, which cannot have two elements as the root element. And so we just created one root element with the fragment. Okay, so now we can indeed see this ID that we passed in, so the selected ID, but of course we don't want this to be hard-coded. So let's set it back to null, and then this will disappear. Indeed. And so the final step, as always, is to update the state. So where are we going to do that? Well, basically, as the user clicks one of these movie objects, or actually movie components. So let's go to the movie component then. And let's do that here with the trick where we hover and then command or control click. So movie list, and then right here on the movie, on the LI, we can attach the on click handler. However, we don't have access to any function here yet. So let's first go back and create that function. So let's do that, well, maybe before the effect. Okay, so let's do that here. So this is just what we have done many times before, which is in the component that owns the state, we write some event handler functions that we then pass down to some child component to update the state in the parent. So here, I will call it handle select movie. And so then this will pass in a movie ID, set selected ID to that ID. And so we could also have simply passed down the set selected ID, but I think like this, it is a little bit cleaner in some situations. All right. So it's cleaner in my view, because like this, we give it a really clear name. And so then we know exactly what's happening. Of course, we didn't pass it yet into the movie. So that movie is inside movie list, and so we need to pass it there first. So here we are going to need a little bit of prop drilling, but if it's just one level, then that's not a big deal at all. So let's call this here on select movie will be handle select movie. And then let's just grab this, move to our movie list. Then we accept that prop here and pass it right into the movie. So just like we have been doing so many times. Accept that here. And then here we need to create a brand new function. Remember, not just calling a function. Okay. And then we pass in the movie.imdb ID. So we can see that right from here. So in each of the movie objects, the ID has this name right here. Okay, give it a save. And now let's see what happens. So we click here, then we get this ID, then we get another one, and then here we get this, which is exactly the same as this one. So this is working great. The only thing I noticed is that here we don't have these styles, which here we have. Let me just see if we are missing. If we are missing some styles here, and apparently this list here also needs the list of movies class. So I forgot that one earlier. And yeah, so now as we hover over each of these movies, we get this nice highlighting. Okay, and now just to finish, let's quickly add the ability to also close basically the movie detail, which is simply to set the selected ID back to null. So let's create that function as well. So handle close movie. And this one doesn't need anything because all it will do is to set the selected ID to null. Okay. And then, of course, we need to pass this function into the movie detail. So right here on close movie. And then let's grab that, move there, pass it in. And now let's just create a button here. And this one has the class of btn back and on click. Well, it's simply on close movie. And so since in this case we are not passing in any ID here or anything, there's no need to create a new function. So of course we could do this, which would be exactly the same thing. But that doesn't make sense in this case, because again, there's no need to pass anything into this function. So let's just do this. But of course, we also need some content into that button. So let's use this HTML entity, which means left arrow. And there we go. So if we click this, then we go back to what we had before. Now, finally, we could also implement that when we click here again, that it will also close the movie. So of course, if we click on one of the other ones, then we see the ID here change. But if we click on the same again, we could also make it so that the movie then closes. And so let's do that to finish this lecture. So going back here, that's not too hard. So right here, we can simply do a ternary operator. So basically we can ask if the ID is equal to the current one, then set the new selected ID to null. So this means that we will now set the new state based on the current one. So let's just use the callback. So selected ID, and then we just say ID equal to the already selected ID. And if so, set the new one to null and otherwise to the passed in ID. So let's try that. And if I click again, then it closes. Beautiful. And so with this, we are now ready to, in the next lecture, actually fetch the movie that corresponds to the selected ID here. So let's now load movie details about individual movies. So essentially, whenever this movie details component here is going to mount, we will want to fetch the movie corresponding to the selected ID. So basically loading the currently selected movie. So since we want to do that each time that this component mounts, that means that we will want a use effect. Right? So our effect function. And then, as I just said, we want this to happen each time the component renders. And so that's simply the empty dependency array. Now, okay, and now we want an async function. And so, well, let's actually write async. So async function, and let's call this one get movie details. Okay, and now let's actually come here to our API documentation. And so now here, what we want to do is to search by ID. So here the parameter is now this I, which will receive exactly this type of IMDb ID that we have been working with. So let's actually grab the fetch from here because it's very similar. So basically just this. And let's place it right here. And so now this is why we had the key in a separate value, because here we of course need that key again. Now here it is I, and then it is here the selected ID. All right, now you see that VS Code and ESLint are already complaining here, but we will for now not give them what they want, basically. So we first want to see what's going to happen. So then let's grab the data here from the response and of course await this data. And then for now, let's just log it to the console. Okay, and this should already be working at this point. So let's reload. And nothing happens. Of course. I mean, VS Code is even telling me about it by saying that I didn't call the function there. So let's try that again. And immediately, actually, it loaded my movie here. So we see that this time we actually get all this data about the movie, which again, we didn't get simply here when we searched for the movies. Okay, but now we want to get some of this data here into our visible user interface, so in a visible part of the component. And so how do we do that? Well, as always, we need a new piece of state. So movie and set movie. And here the default will now be an empty object, because an object is exactly what we got back here from this API call. And so now instead of logging that to the console, let's just do set movie to the data. All right, and so now we should be ready to use that data here in our JSX. So actually, let's destructure now the object, because I really don't like these variable names here, all uppercase. I have no idea why they did it this way. So we will basically now destructure data out of this movie. So the title, we will call title in our own code. Then we will want the year, which is simply called year. We will want the poster. We want the runtime. We want the IMDb rating as well. So this one is actually correct. We want the plot, the released date. So released like this, the actors array, the director, and finally also the genre of the movie. Okay, so we have all these variables, which you see we haven't used yet. Let's just use them here in our rendering logic, just so I can see you what's going to happen. So maybe the title and the year. And so let's reload. Let's select this one. And then you see that first we get undefined, undefined. And then after a second, we get indeed the title and the year. So why is that? Well, here in the very beginning, of course, when the component is initially mounted, then the movie is still this empty object here. And so then title and year read from that empty object are simply undefined. So then this effect here starts and it gets the movie and will then store it into our movie state. And so then the component is re-rendered, and then of course this object is no longer empty. And so then the rendering logic here will read all of this data out of the object, and so then we successfully log that to the console over here. All right, but anyway, let's now actually use this right in our JSX here. So let's start with a header element. So not a component, but really an element. And in there we have an image, which is the poster. And then the alt image, or the alt tag actually. So poster of the movie. So this is a template literal, so it works a bit differently. So what's the problem here now? Of course, I didn't close the image. Next, we have a div with the class of details overview. And so in VS Code, we can actually just type dot and then the class name, then hit tab. And well, that should actually then create a div with that class. So that has always worked. For some reason now that's not working. So let's just do it manually then. So H2 for the title. And here we are typing a lot of JSX. And if you don't want to do that, then you can just get the code here from the final files of this lecture. So here we want the run time. All right, released is not defined. Well, I didn't type that correctly. Now that's already starting to look like something there. Yeah, let's keep going here. Next up, we have the genre. And then also the rating. So here we're going to have like a star emoji. And then here, basically just the IMDb rating. Let's actually write that there. IMDb rating. Yeah, that's looking really nice. So that's the header part here. And so now let's do a section element like this. So a paragraph, and in there I want some emphasized text, which is going to be the movie plot. Then starring the actors. So this is just a string. And then just directed by the director. All right, and there we go. Nice. We still have the selected ID here, which we now no longer need. All right, and now there's just one thing missing. So if you come here, you see that we have this rating component. And does this look familiar to you? Well, we spent like an hour or more building that. So hopefully this is still familiar to you. And so let's actually now grab that star rating component that we built earlier. So let's write star rating, And I thought that it would actually get automatically imported. But let's then do it manually. So I think it should be right here in the same folder. Yeah. So import star rating from, and then star rating. Okay, now here we need the dot for the relative file, and there it is. Now it is a bit too big, and also we want 10 stars, not just 5. So on IMDb, if you know the site, then you know that their movies are rated from 1 to 10. That's also why we have here the 8.8. So here we can now use that API basically that we built for this component. So that's max rating to 10, and then the size of 24, let's say. So that's half the size by default, I think. And then let's also place this into a div with the class name of rating. Okay, beautiful. Now, of course, for now, this rating is not being stored anyway, or anywhere. And so if we reload now, then of course, it is gone. But for now, the component here is working pretty nice, isn't it? But watch what happens if I now try to select another movie here. So let's say this one. So nothing happened, right? Now if I close this and then open up the second one here, for example, then you see that it's working fine. But again, if I now click on another one, then we get the same problem. Our component here is not updating. So why do you think that is? What might be happening here? Well, we told our effect here to load the movie data whenever the component first mounts, right? However, when we click here on one of these other movies, this component is actually not mount again. So the initial render will not happen again because the component is already mounted. And the reason for that is the one that we learned in the previous section. It is because this component here, so the movie detail component, is rendered in exactly the same place in a component tree. And so as we click here on another movie, simply another prop will be passed into the component, but the component itself will not be destroyed. It will stay in the component tree. And so the only thing that is changing as we click on one of the other movies is the ID prop that is being passed in. So the selected ID prop. That's the only thing that is changing. And so therefore, right now, this effect here will not run again, because again, it is only running when the component mounts, which really only happens once. Now, of course, if I close this and then go to another one, then the component has been unmounted first, and then it is mounting again. And so therefore, then it is going to work. So how do we solve this? Well, the answer lies again right here in the dependency array. So here, if we now pass in the selected ID, which is the prop that changes, then let's see what happens. So you saw that now it did actually work. And so the reason is that now as the selected ID prop changes, then the effect will indeed be executed again. Because remember, this dependency array is a little bit like an event listener that is listening for one of the dependencies to change. And so now, as we click on another movie, this prop here will change. And so, yeah, our effect is then executed again, which gives us exactly the functionality that we were looking for. So that's really great and really powerful. And it's therefore also really important to understand how exactly this dependency array works. And now just one final thing, which is that watch what happens when I click on one of the other movies, actually here. Well, probably you cannot really see it because you can't really see when I click, but there is a visible delay between the click and something changing here. And so, of course, that's because in the background, the movie needs to be fetched. So just like before, what we want now is a quick loading indicator just to let the user know that something is happening. And so let's do that exactly as before. So we create a new isLoading_state and then set isLoading, and we start with false. And then immediately before we start fetching, we set isLoading to true, and as soon as it is done, we set it back to false. So just as simple as this. And by the way, in this time here, we are not handling errors, but you could do that just like we did in the beginning. So if you want, you can just go ahead and copy that, basically. But here, in order to save some time, I will just ignore the possibility of there being an error. But anyway, let's now use that loading state. And so let's do it right here. So inside the details. So we always want to return this div here, but if we are still loading, so isLoading, then we want to now use again our loader component. So a reusable component, but if not, then we want the header and the section. And immediately you see the problem, once again, which is that this piece of JSX has two root elements, basically. So it's the header and the section, which is not possible. And so let's close that. And actually here we need the JavaScript mode. And yeah. So you see the loading indicator there is very short, but of course, if our network was just a little bit slower, then it makes a lot of sense to have that loading indicator right there. Great. So this was another very important part of our application, and we did it pretty fast because some parts were just the repetition of before, and we also wrote a lot of JSX here. But yeah, of course, the main part is here the effect and understanding how the dependency array works. So make sure to really get that, and then let's move on and actually make this rating here work so that we can add a movie to our watch list. Let's now make our watched movies list work, and let's do it all in one go. So this is going to be a long one, and so let's quickly get started. And let's actually get started by quickly recapping what this watched list actually is. So remember how we already have this watched state here, which right now is this empty array, but it used to be this temp watched data. So let's close this here. And so you see that then we had these two movies with a few details, with the user rating, and then also this summary right here. Now, of course, we will start from 0 here, and then we can add each of the movies here to our list. So they will then appear over there. So we already have the list component. So that should be somewhere down here. So we have the watched summary, we have the watched movie list, and we have the watched movie itself. So each of these movies needs the poster, the title, the rating, the user rating, and the runtime. So basically, we need to create a brand new object for each of these movies and then pass each of these objects here into this watched array. So actually, let's start by creating that function with which we can add a new item to that array. So let's call it handle add watch. Then we get a movie. Let's call this watched. And then let's do it as always. So we call set watched, and then we get the current watched movies array. And then we create a brand new one based on that one. So based on all the elements of that array, and then the brand new movie object. Okay, and now we just need to pass that in. So again, as a prop. And you see that this component is getting really big, and the same for this entire file. So if you want, feel free to split up this file into multiple files. So one component per file. But anyway, I will just keep working here. And so let's pass that function that we just created here as on add watched handle add watched. So we're passing that into movie details because again, that is where we will actually have the button to add the movie to the watched list. So it will be right here. And so then here in this component, we set the state. It will get updated in the parent. And from there, it goes back here into the statistics and then into this list, of course. Okay, but now let's then move to the movie details component and let's add a button right here. So under this rating. So here, let's say button with the class name of btn add, and then add to list. Now, here, of course, we need our event handler, and let's actually create another event handler right here, which will then call the one that we passed into the component. Because here we actually need to do a lot of stuff. So function handle add. And so again, this one will then eventually call that function that we passed here as a prop. So that was on add watched. So again, in the end, we will call that function here, which remember needs a new movie object as the input. So new movie, basically. So like a new watched movie. So let's create that object here. Let's actually call it new watched movie, just so we understand what we are doing here. So this movie object will also need an IMDb rating, and here we can simply use the one that is currently selected. So the currently selected ID is, of course, the IMDb rating of that movie that we are going to add. Then remember, we also need the title, of course, of the movie, the year, the poster, the IMDb rating. And here we actually need to convert that to a number. And the reason for that is that the rating needs to be a number so that we can then do the statistics here. So calculating the averages. So let's just use the number function on the IMDb rating. And finally, we also need the runtime. Now, if we take a look at one of the movies, you see that the runtime includes the minutes here. And so again, with this, we can then later not do any calculations. So we need to basically split that. So runtime dot split by an empty string, which will just get us that first part. And then from there, we can just take that first part. And then we just convert everything to a number again. Now here we get some problem. It's because we have a duplicate key. And that's because here, of course, it is the IMDb ID. So thanks, ESLint here, for letting me know that was a pretty big problem, actually. So let's see if this already works at this point. So maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But let's see. Let's see our console. So there are a lot of moving pieces here. So let's check. So let's add this to our list. And we didn't get any error. So let's go back to see our list. And there it is. I mean, there are still some problems here, but something did work. So that's great. Now, I think it is because down here, we are using some of these properties with their uppercase letters here. So this should be title and title like this. And yeah, beautiful. The only thing that we are missing here is the stars. And so that's actually what we're going to take care of next. So let's go back here. And I just remembered that actually there's something else. So let's say we also want to add this one. So we add it to the list, but then nothing happens. So I think that as we click here, we should probably close this movie and then basically go back. And so then we can immediately see the new movie that has been added. So that's not too difficult because we already have a function for that. So it's this handle close movie. And so this is the function that we now want to call here as well as soon as a new movie is added there to that list. So into movie details, we already have the function there. Well, that's very convenient. And yeah, of course we do have it because of this button here. Okay, but anyway, yeah, here it is. So after adding a movie, we then want to immediately also close the movie. Okay, let's add this. And so there it is again. Now you immediately see that there is a problem because we already have the movie on the list, but we will take care of that a little bit later. For now, let's take care of the user rating here. So let's maybe just reload, which will clear our list. And yeah. So basically, we want to be able to get this rating here from the user. And then as we add to the list, that should be the rating that should be added here to this new watched movie, right? Or in other words, we now need the state that we have here. So like this 9 rating, we need it outside the star rating component and inside our movie details component. So how do we do that? Well, remember that we actually created a way of getting that state outside the component by adding in a function. So we defined the onSetRating prop. And so into this, we can pass a state setter function. So then we need that state setter function. So let's create yet another piece of state here for that rating. So user rating and set user rating. So use state, and here let's just start at an empty string. Okay. Now for some reason we are already using this somewhere. Well, not really. So I was saying that because it wasn't with the yellow underline. But anyway, let's get this set user rating and then pass it here into our star rating component. Then let's reload. Then let's open up this, give a rating. And if we now check in here in our component, so this we haven't done in a long time, but again, this is really helpful. So here we have, that reset everything. Sometimes that happens when you click. But anyway, here in our movie details, we see all the props, like the selected ID and the state. So here we have, of course, the movie object that has been loading. Then we have the isLoading state, and finally the current rating. And so as we click here now, you see that this changes. And so therefore that means that now we have the state inside our movie details component. Of course, it's also still inside the star rating. So here we have the same. So of course, now that changes to 10. But now it also changed to 10 in movie details. All right, so that's really helpful. And so now we can just add that new state right here to that object. So user rating. And now as we have this user rating, we only want to allow a movie to be added to the list if the user actually gave it a rating. So let's translate that requirement into code. And so what I just said is basically this. So if user rating is greater than 0, then display the button. So let's reload that here manually. Okay, and so now the button is gone. But then as soon as I click here, the button will appear. And now I edit, and there it is. So there is our 8. Now I haven't watched any of these other ones. Let's just give it something. And then indeed, we get this movie with the IMDb rating and with my own rating. And so then the average between these two is actually correctly calculated with 5.5. Great. Now, next up, we need to ensure that I cannot just add this movie here as many times as I want. So of course, I can keep going. And I can keep going over and over again. So now I have the exact same movie here 3 times in my list. And that should not be allowed. So basically, when we come here to this component, we want to check if this movie is already in the list. And if it is, then we don't want to display any of this here. So then we can no longer rate it, and it should then simply display the rating that we already gave. All right. Now, does that maybe sound like something that you might want to try on your own? I know it sounds probably a bit scary, but I think you could actually do it. So if you are up to speed with how the data flows through this application, I think you will be able to do this. So maybe take a minute or two now, and then I see you back here once you are done with that. All right. So maybe you tried it, and if not, that's also absolutely no problem. So what we need to do is to now pass the watched array into that component, right? So that is right here. So the watched array, we simply pass it as a prop. And so then with that, we can check for each of these movies if it is already part of the watched list. Okay, so let's calculate that here. So a new piece of derived state, which is watched. So what we need to do now is to basically check if the watched array that we need to accept here still as a prop. So we need to check if this array of objects includes the array that is currently selected. So let's do that. So watched, and let's first transform this simply into an array of IDs. So we grab all the movies, and then we simply take out the movie.imdb, db. So let's just log that to the console here, just to make sure. All right. Let's check that. Somehow it's taking a lot of time here. So right now we have nothing on the watch list. So let's add a couple of movies there. All right. And for some reason we are getting undefined here. But I see that's because here it should be IMDb ID. And indeed, now it works. So we have this array now. And so now all we need to do is to check whether this array includes the currently selected ID. All right, and now based on that, we will basically display this entire thing here. So all of this. So let's say if is watched. Well, let's start with if it's not watched, then display what we have here. And if not, then let's just create another paragraph here. You rated this movie. And then we can also later calculate or derive the rating that we actually gave. Now here we need to return yet again a piece of JSX with a fragment. So just like this. And yeah, so here is where we then place that paragraph. So working with JSX, as you see, can always be a bit confusing. And even after you have done it for years, it can still take a little bit of time. All right. And now you see, you rated this movie. And the same with this one, but this one we haven't rated, so it's not on our list. So only these two, and so for all the other ones, we can still rate them. So we tried the third one, and so now as we click on that again, then you see that we can no longer add it to the list. So that option is now gone. And so we fixed that problem. Now all we have left to do is to then place the current rating there. So let's again derive that from the watched array. So let's say const watched user rating. And then let's take watched dot find. So we will just find the movie where the movie dot imdb ID is equal to the selected ID. And then if that exists, and so here we are now using optional chaining because there might be actually no movie already in the list. So if we haven't watched a movie, then here this find method will return nothing. And so here then we need optional chaining so that the user rating is only taken from that object in case it actually exists. All right, so again, pretty standard JavaScript right here. But if that's confusing, then yeah, as I said many times, I have a review section for all this stuff right at the beginning of the course. So watched user rating, and yeah, here we go. You rated this movie 7. Maybe let's add some nice emoji here. Once again, so the star, where is it? Okay. And so with this, we are now almost done. So our list works almost the same way as before. So you see, now it is here. And our inception, for example, has the 8, which it also had here. And all the other ones have the 7. Okay. And now the only thing that is left to do is the ability to also remove movies from the list. So that's the only thing that is here in the demo app, but which we do not have yet. So this button right here, where we click, and it will then remove it from the list. All right, so let's go again back up here where the state actually lives. And then let's add the function for handle delete watched. So then here, let's pass in the ID. And then here, we do it just like we always do. So we used the current watched movies array, and then we filter out the one that we no longer want. So we get the current movie, and then if movie.imdb.id is different from the passed in ID, then that movie will stay basically in the array. But if it's the same, then that movie will be filtered out. So it will be deleted basically. And so now let's pass in this function into the list here. So that is the watched movies list. So the movies, so these movies are right here, they are inside the watched movies list. And so therefore we need to pass this function into there so that we can then pass it into each of these movie components right there. So on delete watched is handle delete watched. And let's move there. So on delete watched. And then let's immediately pass that down into the child component. So on delete watched is on delete watched. Okay. And then let's go there. That's right here. On delete watched. And don't worry if it's taking you a lot longer to process all of this. So to write all the code, that's just completely normal, of course. So when I built this app here for the first time, it also took me a few hours to build this. So it was not nearly as fast as right now. But of course, here we cannot take like 30 hours just to build one small application, right? But anyway, here let's now create this button. We need to give it the class of btn delete. And then on click, and don't forget, it needs to be a function, not a function call. So on delete watched. And then all we have to do is to pass in the ID. So once again, that's movie.imdb ID. And that should be it. So you see that the buttons are here. And let's see. Yes, that works. And our statistics get updated. Now here we have still this weird thing where JavaScript is like really bad at math. Or actually this time it looks like it's not even JavaScript's fault. But let's just fix that because that looks just like really bad. So we should be able to just append a to fixed here, hopefully. Yeah, that's a lot better. Let's do the same here for the rating. To fixed. So the 2 here is the number of decimal points, basically, that we are allowing. Yeah, but anyway, that's actually it. So you see our stats update in real time, of course. And now everything is back to 0. All right, so as I said in the beginning, it was a long lecture, but we also got a lot of stuff done. Now I'm aware that we moved a lot of like data up and down the tree, and the same for some handler functions. And so please again, just make sure that you really understand what we just did here. And with that, I think our component tree can really help you out a lot. So just analyze all the props that all these components receive, how the state changes over time. And so all of that will really help you out in becoming a better React developer. Because as I mentioned many times before, you will also have to learn to work with other developers' code. And so then these skills of really analyzing the code and the data flow will become very handy. In this video, let's change the page title in the browser to the movie that we are currently watching. So to show you, let's again come to our demo here. And so watch what happens here to the browser tab title as I click on one of the movies. So you see that now the title of the page is equal to the movie that we are currently checking out. And if I then click on another one, then of course that changes to the new movie. All right, and so let's do the same thing in our application as well. Now to start, as we see, the initial title of the page is actually Use Popcorn. So the name of the application and not just React app. So let's come into our public folder and in index.html, let's just change the title here to Use Popcorn. Give it a save and then immediately it changed up here. Okay, but anyway, let's now actually try to implement changing the title to the currently watched movie. So how are we going to do that? Well, changing the page title in the browser, so outside here of the application, is a side effect because we are very clearly going to interact with the outside world. So basically with the world outside of our React application. And so again, this is then considered a side effect. So what this means is that we will want to register a side effect using, again, the useEffect hook. Now, where exactly are we going to do that? So in which component are we going to use useEffect? Or in other words, in which component do we actually want to register the side effect? Well, thinking about it, we want this title here to change as soon as we click on one of these movies, which will then trigger the movie details component here to mount. And so it's in exactly that situation where we want to change the browser title here. And so that component is where we want that effect. So let's come to movie detail. And yeah, so this is the component. And so let's simply add another effect here. So we should always use different effects for different things. So basically that each effect has only one purpose. So it only does one thing. So this will be our effect. And then we want to run that effect on mount. Okay. And now it's very easy. So we can just change the title of the page in the browser by setting document.title. And for now, let's just use something else here. And you see that actually it already changed to test right here. But let's just reload. And so then it goes back to use popcorn. And then when I click, it changed to test. Nice. So that's already working. But of course, we now want the actual title there. So let's use a template literal. And then I will just write movie. And then the actual title of the movie. Give it a save. And immediately we get Inception here. And here in the title. But again, let's just reload. And you see that now it actually says undefined. So why is that? That looks very weird, right? But let's think about it, because after we do that, it will actually make sense. So our effect here will right now only be executed as the component first mounts, right? Now at that point, so when the component first mounts, what is the title going to be? And remember how actually we already inspected that earlier. But let's just do that again. So logging to the console, here we notice, well, actually we don't notice anything. So let's just reload, then clear this, then click. And so you see that initially the title is undefined, which is because in the beginning, this movie object is still empty. And only after the movie actually arrives from the API, the component will re-render, and then we have the correct title that is then logged to the console. So moving back to our effect, basically what happens here is that again, in the beginning, the title is undefined. And so since this effect only runs exactly once when the component mounts, it will just stay undefined forever. So when the component re-renders with the correct movie object and the correct title, our effect will right now not react to that. So it will not be re-executed. Now, luckily for us, we already know how to fix that, right? So we just have to include this title variable here in the dependency array. And so then if we give it a save, then you see that it actually changed to the correct title. Let's just try that again. So first we get undefined and then we get inception, which again is because now our effect is basically listening for this variable to change. And when it does change, then our effect is executed again. Now there's just one problem, which is that we actually don't want to see the undefined here in the beginning. So we don't want temporarily to be our movie set to undefined. But we can simply fix that by writing if there is no title, then just return. So try that again. And yeah, that's fixed now. Now also because we did this here, so we specified the title, we can now move to another movie and it will then automatically change the title up here, which if we hadn't done this, this actually wouldn't happen. So let's just remove it just so I can show you. And well, now actually we never see anything because we have this early return here. So let's try that again. Okay, and now again, as I click another one, we see that the title stays at undefined. So this component here has re-rendered, and so the title has changed, but of course our effect did not react to that. And again, that's because we are missing this critical dependency in the dependency array. But now with this, it does actually work. Great. There's just one final problem, which is that when we go back, then you see that the movie actually stays here in the title. So let's do another one. Then of course it is correct. But again, if we go back, then the title will stay here. So it will not go back to just use popcorn as we would probably want. So it doesn't make any sense that now here we still have the Inception movie while we are no longer seeing that movie. So how could we change that? I mean, nowhere in our code we are actually telling React to go back to the use popcorn title, right? And right now we actually don't know how to do that yet, because for that we will first need to learn about the concept of cleaning up. And so let's do that right in the next lecture. So the third part of an effect is the cleanup function. And so let's now come back to the timeline that we have looked at before and the holds that we have left in it. So remember that after the last effect run, the title of the page in the browser tab was set to Interstellar Wars, right? However, once we unmounted the movie details component, we would probably like the title to return to the original text, which was simply use popcorn. So just the name of the application. But how could we do that? How can we ensure that the page title stays synchronized with the application even after the component has disappeared? Well, basically what we need is a way to execute some code as the component unmounts. And we can do exactly that by returning a so-called cleanup function from the effect. And in this case, that's simply a function that sets the title back to use popcorn. All right, but you see that we still have another hole here in the timeline. And that's because the cleanup function that we return from the effect is actually also executed on re-renders. So right before the next effect is executed again. So let's recap this important new information that we just learned. So the cleanup function is a function that we can return from an effect. And I say can because the cleanup function is optional. So we don't have to return one from the effect. Now the cleanup function will run on two occasions. First, it runs before the effect is executed again in order to clean up the results of the previous side effect. It also runs right after the component instance has unmounted in order to give us the opportunity to reset the side effect that we created if that's necessary. So remember that we have the dependency array in order to run code whenever the component mounts or re-renders. And now with the cleanup function, we also have a way to run some code whenever the component unmounts. And so with this, we have the entire component lifecycle covered. Now, you might be wondering, when do we actually need a cleanup function? Well, basically, we need a cleanup function whenever the side effect keeps happening after the component has been re-rendered or unmounted. For example, you might be doing an HTTP request in your effect. Now, if the component is re-rendered while the first request is still running, a new second request would be fired off, right? And so this might then create a bug called a race condition. And therefore, it's a good idea to cancel the request in a cleanup function whenever the component re-renders or unmounts. And of course, there are many other examples. So when you subscribe to some API service, you should cancel the subscription. When you start a timer, you should stop the timer in the cleanup function. Or if you add an event listener, you should clean up by removing it. Okay, and now to finish, let me give you one more important rule about effects, which is that each effect should only do one thing. So if you need to create multiple effects in your components, which is completely normal, just use multiple use effect hooks. This not only makes each effect much easier to understand, but it also makes effects easier to clean up using a cleanup function. And with that being said, let's return to our application. So, with our knowledge about the cleanup function, we can now very easily solve the problem that we still have with our page title. So, remember that we need a cleanup function whenever the side effect that we introduced in the effect keeps happening after the component has already been unmounted. And so that is actually exactly our case here. So indeed, we no longer have the Inception movie here, but the side effect is still happening. So the title is still showing that old movie that we had selected before. And so the cleanup function is of course the perfect solution for this case. So a cleanup function, remember, is simply a function that we return from an effect. And so let's specify a function here and then return it from the effect function. Okay, and here all we want to do is to basically reset the document.title to its original form. So that's use popcorn. And this is all we have to do. So let's reload. Let's select our movie. Then indeed we get the title, but as we go back, our title also goes back to use popcorn. Great. And so this is actually all the code that we have to write to solve this problem. But let's just do a quick experiment just so I can show you something. So let's log to the console here also in this situation, clean up effect for movie and then the title. And here we keep getting these random errors, which is because one of these images here cannot be found. So that's a bit annoying, but let's just ignore that. So let's reload, clear the console here, then select one of the movies. And now as I go back, we already know that this function here will get executed. And so again, that's because this component here will be unmounted. And so that's when the cleanup function of the effect will get executed. So our title will change, and let's see what is logged to the console. So we get cleanup effect for movie Inception. Now it might seem obvious that we get the name here, but if we think about it, it actually might seem a bit strange, right? Because as we learned in the previous lecture, this cleanup function here will actually run after the component has already unmounted. And so if that's the case, then how will the function actually remember this title here? So again, this function here runs only after the component has already disappeared from our component tree, and so all the state, including the movie object, has been destroyed. But still, our function here remembers the title. So how is that? Well, it's because of a very important concept in JavaScript called a closure. So basically, a closure in JavaScript means that a function will always remember all the variables that were present at the time and the place that the function was created. So in the case of our cleanup function here, it was created by the time this effect first was created here. And so by that time, the title was actually defined as Inception. So in this case, the movie that we were seeing before. So it was Inception at the time this function was created. And so therefore, we say that this function closed over the title variable and will therefore remember it in the future. So in this case, even after the component has already unmounted. Okay, so that was just a bit of a theoretical explanation of what happens behind the scenes, but I think it's pretty important to understand this idea of closures because it is really a crucial part of how effects work in React. And therefore, we will actually also come back to this issue a bit later. But anyway, I also want to show you that the cleanup function runs between renders. So basically after each re-render. So if we click here on some movie, and then we click on another one, let's say this one here, then you see that the cleanup function actually run again for this movie. And so that happened right after the re-render. Right, let's just clean this to watch that again. So as I click here, there will be a re-render. And so again, then the previous effect was cleaned up with the previous movie that we had selected before. Next up, we also need to clean up our data fetching, because right now we're actually creating way too many HTTP requests as we search for movies. And to show you what I mean by that, let's make our window here a bit bigger. Let's come to our network tab again. Let's add some throttling here, and then make sure that you're here in the fetch tab only. Then let's clear all the requests that had been made before, and then I will just very quickly search for a movie here. All right. And so here we can now see all the requests that have been made. So basically we see that we made one request for each keystroke. So it started here, then or whatever, then incept, and all the way until the final word. Now the problem with that is that this created all these different requests that were basically happening at the same time. And that has two problems. First of all, having so many requests at the same time will slow each of them down. And second, this means that we will end up downloading way too much data, because we're actually not even interested in the data for all of these other queries. But still, they were downloaded here. Now in this case, it's very, very little data, so that's not going to have any impact. But in another application, this might actually become a problem. And so let's now learn how we can clean up basically our fetch requests so that as soon as a new request is fired off, the previous one will stop. So it will get cancelled. And actually, I forgot to mention the third big problem with having all of these requests happening at the same time, which is, imagine that actually, for example, this request here would take a little bit longer than the other ones. So if this request here would be the last one to arrive, let's say this one, well, here we then get the response if we click. But anyway, again, let's imagine that this request for some reason took a lot longer than all the other ones. And so then this one would be the last one to arrive. And so in that case, it would be the movie's or the results from this request that would be stored in our state and that would be rendered in our UI, which is of course not what we want. We always want exactly the last request of all to be the one that matters, right? So all these other ones, again, we are not interested in them. But if one of them takes longer than the rest, then that one will actually become the one that we see in our UI. And this is actually a pretty common problem, which even has the name of a race condition, because all these requests here are basically racing with one another, seeing which one arrives first. And so let's now fix that issue back in our code. And the way that we will do this is by using a native browser API, which is the abort controller. And we will then use that abort controller in our cleanup function. So the first step for using the abort controller is to actually create one. So let's define a new variable called controller, and then we use new abort controller. And again, this is actually a browser API. So this has nothing to do with React, but with the browser itself. So just like the fetch function right here. Okay. Then here, in order to connect the abort controller with the fetch function, we pass in a second argument where we define an object with the signal property. And so there we pass in controller.signal. So it's not really important to understand exactly how this abort controller works. This is basically just following a recipe. Okay. So we have our abort controller and we connected it with our fetch. And so now in the cleanup function, so a function that we return from here, we can then actually say controller.abort. All right, and that's actually it. So let's see that this works in practice, and then we will understand what is happening here, and we will also do some minor fixes. So let's make this big again so we can see, and reload the entire thing. And immediately you see a small problem here. But for now, let's ignore that and again search for a movie. Okay, now here we have different types. So we have this fetch and the fetch redirect for some reason, but we are only interested in the fetches here. And immediately you see that all these other ones, which are not the last one, got cancelled, right? And so we can also see that now we no longer have all these different requests happening at the same time. So this one here started basically, and then immediately as the next one started, this one was finished. So it was cancelled. This thing keeps popping up, makes it hard to explain. And yeah, then finally, the last one that we were actually interested in was of course not cancelled. So this one then went all the way until the end. All right, but here we can very clearly see that there is basically only one request happening at a time until it then got cancelled by the next one. So let's just see why this is actually working. So each time that there is a new keystroke here, the component gets re-rendered, right? And as we already know, between each of these re-renders, this function here, so the cleanup function, will get called. And so what that means is that each time that there is a new keystroke, so a new re-render, our controller will abort the current fetch request. And so that is exactly what we want, right? So we want to cancel the current request each time that the new one comes in. And so that is exactly the point in time in which our cleanup function gets called. And so again, the cleanup function is a perfect place for doing this kind of work between renders. Now, the problem with this is that as soon as a request gets cancelled, JavaScript actually sees that as an error. And so that's why we then get the error here. So basically this fetch request, as it is cancelled, it will throw an error, which will then immediately go here into our catch block, where the error is set. And so that's why we can also see the errors down here. So saying that the user aborted a request, which is exactly what we have here. However, this is not really an error here in our application. And so we want to ignore that. So what we can do in order to do that is to say if error.name is different from abort error, only then we actually want to set the error. And this works because the error that is thrown here, so this object that we then get access to, will have the name property set to abort error. And then here we use that to our advantage to again basically ignore these errors that are of this type. And so only if they're not, we set the error to the one that we are interested in. Now to make this work, here actually we need to also set the error to an empty string after the movies have been set. So we basically set the error to an empty string here at the beginning and at the end as well. Okay, and so let's try that now. And we're still doing that throttling. That's why it took so much time here. But anyway, let's just again clean this here. And so now we never got that error, but we still got all our, and again, so we still got all our requests here canceled. And so no more race conditions and no more unnecessary data being fetched. And so if at some point in the future you are going to do your own HTTP requests in an effect like this, make sure to always clean up after your fetch requests in case that you have a situation where many requests can be fired off very rapidly one after another, which is exactly the situation that we have here. So here, when we click on one of the movies and the data gets fetched, then usually we will not have so many requests one after another, unless we click like really fast between these movies right here. But that's usually not going to happen. And so therefore, there's no need to clean up the fetch that we're doing here in this movie details component. Let's now implement a new small feature which will require us to listen globally to a key press event. So let's check out what that feature is in our demo. And so basically it's very simple. When we open up a movie here to see the details, instead of clicking here on this button to go back, we want to now implement the feature that the user can also just click on the escape key. So you can see that, but I'm doing it now. And so with this, the movie detail was then closed. And so again, for that, we basically need to globally listen to that key press event. So let's get to work. And the way in which we can react to a key press event in the entire app is basically by simply attaching an event listener to the entire document. So let's do that here right in the app component. And so since this is clearly a side effect, because we will be directly touching the DOM, we need another effect. So just to show you that we are indeed in the app component. And so let's create that effect right here. So use effect, then our effect function. And then as always, we start by saying basically that this effect should run on mount. And so now all we need to do is to write document.addEventListener, which remember is simply a DOM function. So we are really doing basically now some DOM manipulation. And so we are stepping really outside of React here, which is the reason why the React team also calls the useEffect hook here an escape hatch. So basically a way of escaping having to write all the code using the React way. Okay. But anyway, here let's now listen for the key down event. And then as our callback function here, we just pass in a function which receives the event. And now we can simply say if the event.code, which is basically the code of the key press. So if that is equal escape, then we will want to call our handle close movie function. So we already have that functionality. And so all we have to do is to call that function right here. And let's also, just for some experiment, log here something to the console. So just like this. And let's reload here, but let's first actually come back to our network and disable any throttling. So let's reload, then let's open up a movie, and then let's see what happens when I hit the escape key. And indeed, the movie here was closed, and we also got our closing logged to the console. But watch what happens right now as I hit the escape key again. So you see, we get closing again, and actually even twice. But again, that's simply because in strict mode, these effects here are running twice. So again, as I keep hitting the escape key, we see here by this log that actually this callback function here, so the event listener, is still listening for the key down event, and it will then execute this function each time that the key press happens. Which is, however, not really what we want in this situation, because we actually don't even have a movie opened here. So basically what we want instead is to only attach this event listener here to the document whenever we actually have the movie details in our tree. So whenever that component instance is actually mounted. So that's easy enough. We just cut the effect from here. And so after all, we want it in our movie details component. All right, I just started to place it there so that we could understand why we actually need it here. And now here, of course, this function is called onCloseMovie, which again, we had already passed into this component right here. Now here you see that actually ESLint is complaining, and the reason for that is that we must actually include this function here also in our dependency array. So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but we will later learn why that is. So again, when React tells us that we need to include something here in the array, we actually must do that. Otherwise, there might be some consequences that we do not want. And so again, whenever you see some warning here coming from ESLint about a missing dependency, you must include that in the array. So otherwise, React says that you are lying about your dependencies. And that, of course, we don't want. But anyway, let's now try to hit the escape key again while the movie details component is not mounted. And so now we didn't get that console.log. And so therefore, now this function is of course not being executed. But as I open up the movie and then I hit the key again, then you see that we get the closing log, and of course the movie has closed. Okay, let's do that again. And notice how now we are getting even more of these logs here. Let's clean that and do that again. And a few more times. And so you see that we get dozens of these logs here saying closing, which don't really seem to make much sense. So if we reload the page and then do that again, then we are back to only having these two logs, which again come because the effect is executed twice. But now, if I close another movie, then all of a sudden we get 3 logs. And so it seems like these are basically accumulating, right? So the reason for that is that actually each time that a new movie details component mounts, a new event listener is added to the document. So basically always an additional one to the ones that we already have. So again, each time that this effect here is executed, it will basically add one more event listener to the document. And so if we open up 10 movies and then close them all, we will end up with 10 of the same event listeners attached to the document, which of course is not what we want. And so what this means is that here we also need to clean up our event listeners. Or in other words, we need to return a function here which will call, or which will execute document.remove event listener. So basically, as soon as the movie details component unmounts, the event listener will then again be removed from the document. And so then we will avoid having so many event listeners in our DOM, which might become a memory problem in a larger application with like hundreds or thousands of event listeners. So again, in this small app, of course, this wouldn't be a problem, but this is just to teach you. So to prepare you for the real life later. Now here, the function that we pass in, so the one that we want to remove, must be exactly the same as here in the add event listener. And so we cannot simply copy and paste this function right here. So it must be, again, the same. And so let's cut it from here and create a brand new function here. Let's just give it a name of callback. And then let's use that here and here. Give it a save. Let's reload here. Okay. I hit escape. And let's try it a couple more times. And you see that now we only get one closing each time that I hit the escape key. Or in other words, actually our event listener is only executed exactly once, which was exactly the goal of our cleanup function here. Great. So this is how we handle key press events in a React application. So again, we need to basically step out of the React way and back into like classical DOM stuff. And so for that, we need an effect. So we specified our effect, we listen for the event, and each time that the component unmounts, or even each time that it re-renders, we will then remove the old event listener from the document. All right, and this is actually going to be the last lecture of this section. And so let's clean up the application here a little bit before we leave this section, even though we will actually keep working on it in the next one. But still, let's do some stuff here now, which is to, for example, remove all of these redundant and unnecessary console.logs. We also have some other cleanup here, like this. So this one we don't need, but maybe let's just comment this one out, because this was nice for the explanation of the closure, remember? And then, of course, also, when we open up the app, of course, we don't want to display search results for a predefined movie. So in this case, for the Inception movie. So let's remove that from state and simply start with no search term at all. All right, then here we should probably not log these errors here as console.error, but as a console.log. And also, when the error is an abort error, we don't even need to log anything, because again, for us, those are actually not really errors. And finally, let's now search for a movie here. So Interstellar, for example. All right, so I selected the movie, and now let's say that I search for something else. And so in this situation, I think that it would be best to close the current movie here. So whenever there is a new search, we simply want to close the movie. And so that's pretty simple. We just have to, before we fetch the movie, simply call handle close movie. And so with this, let's see. So we open up this one and then let's search. Let's see what actually turns up for Jonas. Something about the Jonas Brothers. Yeah, but anyway, you saw that as I did a new search, then the movie here actually disappeared. And the same now again. Okay, now as we load the application right now, so on the initial render of the entire app, we notice that right now we are no longer fetching any data, right? So we are only fetching data as a result of searching here for movies in the search bar. So basically only as a response to this event. And so therefore we could now actually transform this use effect that we have here into a regular event handler function. Because remember, that is actually the preferred way of handling events in React. And again, this is actually now more of an event handler than anything else, right? So again, if you think about that, then maybe you come to the same conclusion that maybe this shouldn't be an effect anymore and really an event handler function. So if you want, you can go ahead and convert that, but it's also not really necessary because the main point of this section here was to learn about the use effect hook. And in many situations, we do actually want to start fetching on mount. And so in those situations, this is still a perfectly valid way of doing that, at least in small applications like this one. But anyway, with this, we wrap up the section. And so now all there's left to do is, as always, a nice coding challenge so that you can practice on your own. Welcome to the next coding challenge. And in this one, we will build this very simple currency conversion tool. So here we can input some amount of money that we want to convert from one currency to another. So let's say, for example, we want to convert 100 euro, so the input currency, to the output currency, which is US dollars right now. And so you see that the converted value is $107.70. And this conversion here is actually done by an API, which contains real-time currency conversion data. And so by the time you're watching this, the value here will most likely look different. And of course, we can also change the currencies. So let's say we want to convert from US dollar to euro, so the other way around, and then 100 euros, or actually $100, is just 93 euros. All right, so this is the task for this lecture. And as always, we are starting from some very simple starter file. So here I already have basically the HTML skeleton laid out for you here in the app component. And so your task now is to first transform these elements here into controlled input elements. So just like we have done before. And then after that, I want you to use an effect like we did in this section in order to actually do an API call to this URL here, which will then do the actual conversion. So here again is the URL of the API that we're going to use. So your fetch request will be made to this URL right here, and then you can replace the amount, the from currency, and the to currency. And if you want to get more information about this API, you can just go to this link right here. All right. And so as you see here in the demo, the conversion is made each time that one of these three fields here updates. So if I delete something here, then immediately the value is updated here with the new value coming from the API. And the same if we change here to some other currency. So this is going to be a bit similar to what we did throughout this section. And so take a few minutes now, and I see you back here once you are finished, so that you can then check out if your solution is correct and what you could have done maybe differently. Okay, so I hope that you had a great time with building this calculator and that you had some success with it. So if your calculator works, then you are already done with this video here. But in any case, I will of course now implement my own solution here. And I will just start by making these three elements here controlled elements. So let's create some pieces of state. So amount and set amount. And of course, you could have called them any other thing. So that's not really important. And let's actually start with 1 here. So that's const. And then here, let's do the from currency and set from currency. And here the default is going to be 0. And then let's do the same for the other currency. So to currency and set to currency. And so here let's use by default US dollar. And now we just need to wire all that up here with these elements. So the value should be the amount. And then on change, we do set amount is equal to e.target.value. But we should not forget to actually convert this to a number, because otherwise we get a string and that we cannot really convert. Well, probably we could actually, because we will then plug it here into a string later, but yeah, it's nicer to have it all in the correct data format here. But anyway, this now is the from currency, and then on change will be set from currency, again, e.target.value. Okay, and now I will just copy the same thing here to the other select element. So to currency and set to currency. And here we are missing this closing brackets. And yeah, that's it for the controlled elements. And so let's now get to work on the effect. So use effect and then passing in our effect function as always. And then let's initially run this on component mount. So we will do an HTTP request to this URL right here. And therefore we will need a fetch function which returns a promise. And therefore we now need an async function. And since the effect function itself cannot be async, let's create another one in here. So async function, and calling it simply convert. And then later we will simply call that function in here. Okay, and now let's do the actual conversion itself. So we will do our fetch request to this URL right here. So let's grab that. And then, of course, we need to replace all these values here in this template literal. So amount. Here we have the from currency. And then finally, we have also the to currency. And so this will, remember, return a promise. And so let's await that promise and store it in a variable called response. And then from there, let's also await the data itself. So we'll await by converting the response to JSON. And then let's start by simply logging that to the console. So checking out the data so that we know which format it has. And immediately we see down here that we get a result. And so that means that our effect is already working with the default data that we gave it here. So here then we can see that inside the rates object, we have the USD property, which is our to currency. And so that's the converted value right here. So let's try to read that value. So that's inside data.rates. And now we need to dynamically read the property from there. So in this case, that's USD. But of course, we cannot hard code that, because if our to currency would be euros, then here we would have euros. And so we can simply read the property by doing it like this. And so there is our number. And so instead of logging it to the console, we now want to have it appear on the screen right here. So, as always, what we need is a new piece of state. And set converted. And so just like before, as soon as the data arrives, we will update the state, which will then update our user interface and show us the converted value. Here, let's start with nothing. And yeah, simply replacing this console.log with set converted. Give it a save, and nothing happened. But it should happen as we reload the page. Well, actually not. And well, of course, the reason is that down here we still hard-coded the output. So here now we want to read converted, and then we can even write the to currency here as well. So we have 1.0717 US dollars. Great. So that's working just fine. But what if we change something here? So now I update this to 100, but you see that nothing is happening. And if you remember everything we just learned throughout this section, this is going to make total sense to you. Because as we type a new number here, we will update the state that is inside the app component. And therefore, we will re-render this component. However, our effect right now only runs on the initial render. So we don't have anything here in our dependency array, and so React has no way of knowing that it should also rerun this effect right now. And so let's change that. So let's basically give our dependency array all the values that our effect in fact depends on. And so those are amount, the from currency, and the to currency. So each time one of these three changes, then our effect here should basically synchronize with any of those. So amount, from currency, and to currency. And again, here I like to use the analogy that this dependency array is essentially like listening for one of these three variables to change, and then each time that happens, it will just re-execute our effect again. And so this means that really our effect is now synchronized to these three variables. Great. And so, as we type here, you see that the value actually updates. Now you do see maybe that it takes some time for the update to happen. Let's maybe click here and notice that the change wasn't immediate. And if you have a slower internet connection, then maybe for you it will take even longer. And so that's of course because our application needs to make this API call, and only after that the state is updated. So only then we get our result, which we can display here. So to tell the user about that, we again need our loading state. So let's do that. And notice how here we are just ignoring errors. So if something goes wrong, then we are not accounting for that situation right here. But this is just a challenge to make the effect work. So set is loading to true. And of course, first I need to create this new piece of state. So is loading and set is loading. And we start with false. And then before the fetch happens, we set it to true. And once we are done, we set it to false again. So set is loading back to false. But now where do we actually use this is loading state? So we could, of course, again display some loader here. So something like a text displaying loading. But instead what I want to do here is to basically disable these three fields. And so that then has the purpose of showing the user that something is happening. And also, besides that, it then prevents the user from typing in anything else and creating multiple HTTP requests at the same time. So let's do that. And this we haven't done before, actually, but in all of these input elements, we can specify the disabled prop, which again is standard HTML. And so disabled basically takes a true or false. So if we set it just to true here, then you see that it gets like grayed out, and then we cannot do anything with it. Now, of course, we don't want it to always be true, but instead we want it to be disabled when is loading is true. Okay. And we will do this many other times throughout the course. So this is a pretty common thing to do, actually. Okay. And this one as well. And now watch what happens when I click. So very shortly, these three got disabled, which shows the user that indeed something is happening, so that the data is being loaded in the background. Now, there's just one final thing that I want to do, which is what happens when these two are the same. And in fact, we even get an error in this situation, because the API is not made for the case that we are converting from one currency to the same one. So let's fix that, and that's not too hard. So before we do any of this, we can check if the from currency is the same as the to currency. And so in that case, then we basically do not want to run the convert function. So let's do that down here. So outside of this function and before even calling it. So we just say if from cur is equal to the to currency, then return and also set the converted value to the amount, which is simply because the converted value will be the same as the amount if the currency is the same, right? So let's try that here. I'm just reloading to getting rid of those errors. And then let's see. And there we go. So now €1 is €1, and we didn't even have to call the API for this conversion, because it is, in fact, not really a conversion. Okay, and that's it, I think. Now, remember that we ignored errors here, so we didn't handle them at all, but you should never do that in the real world. So that's just something that I wanted to mention here, but since this is just a learning exercise, that's no big deal. But anyway, with this, we finish yet another section. So congratulations on the great progress that you have been making up until this point. And now, after you hopefully review everything we just learned in this section, I see you right in the next one, where we will dive even deeper into the topic of React hooks.